Arin watched as Edmere tightened the ropes around the smiling knight, ensuring there was no room for escape. The man had laughed at first, even as Edmere bound him. But now, as they rode toward Castle Thorn, his smirk had faded. Still, his tongue remained sharp. "You've got soft hands, boy," the smiling knight drawled, shifting slightly despite the ropes biting into his wrists. "A squire, are you? Or did they dress you up in that armor just to make Edmere here look important?" Arin tensed, but he didn't rise to the bait. He kept his eyes on the road, though his grip on the reins tightened. The weight of responsibility already pressed on him. This journey, this prisoner, it was all bigger than just another lesson in knighthood. "You fought well," Arin said evenly. "But you're in ropes now. Maybe talk less and think more." The smiling knight chuckled. "Oh, I think plenty, boy. I think about how men like Edmere teach pups like you to yap and bite, but never how to hunt. That's why you'll die with a sword in your hand and piss in your britches." He turned his head slightly, studying Arin. "You don't have a killer's eyes." "Not yet. But you will, if you live long enough. And that's the cruelest joke of all." Arin felt his chest tighten, heat rising in his face. "I don't need a killer's eyes to know a beaten man when I see one," he shot back. The smiling knight grinned, teeth bared. "That's the thing, pup. You think I lost. But I'm still smiling. And you're still wondering if you'll make it through what comes next." His voice dropped, low and needling. "How long before Edmere decides you're too soft for this life? Before he hands you off to some lesser knight who needs a bootlicker instead of a squire?" That got a reaction. Arin opened his mouth, anger flashing through him, but before he could speak, there was a dull thwack. The smiling knight's head jerked forward as Edmere brought a thick branch down on his skull, hard enough to silence him, but not enough to knock him unconscious. The man let out a low grunt, his smirk finally wiped away. "Enough," Edmere said, his voice quiet but firm. His grip on the branch was tight, his knuckles white. "You'll keep your tongue, or I'll take it." For a long moment, there was only the sound of hooves against dirt. Arin exhaled, unclenching his fists. The smiling knight sat still, head bowed slightly, his grin gone. Arin watched as Edmere was ushered into the war chamber, the heavy oak doors closing behind him with a dull thud. He followed a few paces behind, careful to keep his steps quiet. A squire should be seen, not heard. Arin listened. He always listened. It took a day to arrive at Castle Thorn. The Queen's council room was thick with candle smoke and the damp earthen scent of old stone. Arin's gaze flickered across the room, taking in the Queen's advisors standing in a half-circle around the great table, their expressions carved from worry and old grief. No one spoke at first. The air itself seemed weighed down with expectation. He turned his eyes toward the Queen, watching as she stood at the head of the table. There was no uncertainty in her stance, no hesitation in the way she carried herself. Yet Arin caught something beneath her poise, a weariness carefully masked behind steel. Arin watched as the smiling knight was dragged in behind them, his head still dipped slightly from the blow Edmere had given him earlier. But Arin didn't trust that bowed head. He caught the flicker of movement in the man's mouth, the slow curl of something almost like amusement, a secret joke, one the rest of them weren't privy to. Lord Varlin was the first to break the silence. "You've done well," he said, his nod acknowledging Edmere before shifting to the bound prisoner. "But your work is not yet done." Arin watched Edmere straighten his shoulders, his expression unchanging. "What is required of me?" There was no hesitation, no flicker of doubt, as if no task, no matter how impossible, could shake him. Arin wished he could feel that same certainty. The Queen's gaze locked onto Edmere, her voice even but firm. "You and 150 squires will enter the forest and face a Dasi. If you can defeat it, you will capture the Pretender King's princess. That is your true test." Arin felt his chest tighten. A Dasi. Even he knew the stories. Warriors beyond compare, bound to duty with a skill that no man could match. They did not tire. They did not falter. They did not lose. Arin watched as Edmere gave the slightest nod, his voice steady. "It will be done." Arin swallowed, glancing toward him, searching for any sign that the weight of those words affected him. But Edmere's face remained unreadable. Did he not realize what he was agreeing to? Or did he understand too well? The Queen's gaze sharpened. "You say that, as if it is a certainty." Arin watched Edmere lift his chin slightly, his stance unwavering. It must be. A knight does not doubt the path before him. Arin's hands curled into fists at his sides. Certainty was a fine thing, a noble thing, but belief alone did not stop a blade, and certainty did not kill a Dasi. The Queen let out a slow breath, her frustration measured but unmistakable. "A knight does not face a Dasi and live, either." Her voice lowered, meant for Edmere alone, but Arin heard it anyway. "I know what you want. You believe that if you bring me this victory, if you hand me my enemies bound and broken, it will be enough." Arin's brow furrowed. Enough for what? A title? The Queen's favor? Something else? Something unspoken? He watched as Edmere remained still, saying nothing, not confirming, not denying. The Queen tilted her head slightly, studying him. "You do not understand," she continued. "A Dasi does not lose. Not in the way we think of victory and defeat." A slow chill crept down Arin's spine. A knight fought with discipline, with skill, with honor. A Dasi fought to win. Arin watched as Edmere's fingers curled ever so slightly at his sides. It was the only sign that he felt anything at all. Lord Varlin cleared his throat, shattering the silence. "There is no choice. The Pretender King's daughter is well guarded. The Dasi is her shield. If we are to take her, we must face it." Arin's throat felt dry. He wanted to speak, to ask the question, gnawing at the back of his mind. "And what if we fail?" The Queen's lips pressed together. "Then may the gods help you." Arin watched as Edmere bowed his head, the room seeming to exhale with him. The next morning, they marched into the dense forest. The trees loomed overhead, their branches entwining like skeletal fingers, blotting out the rising sun. The deeper they went, the quieter it became, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Arin's grip tightened on his small blade, though his hands trembled despite himself. He wasn't ready for this, he thought. Scared. He held his breath to stop his hands from shaking. He watched the 150 squires stand in one disciplined line, shields together, spears and swords between them, their steel catching the dim, shifting light. Arin swallowed hard, trying to steady his breathing. He had pictured battle before. Glorious, honorable, something out of the old stories. but standing behind them, surrounded by the quiet dread of the trees. He wasn't so sure anymore. Then came the rustling. His pulse quickened. The underbrush quivered, as if the forest itself was coming alive. And then, movement. Hundreds of young women in monk robes emerged from the trees, stepping in eerie unison. Their faces were calm, their movements graceful, but the glint of steel in their hands was unmistakable. Arin barely had time to process what he was seeing before they struck. The front lines clashed. Blades met blades. Cries of pain split the morning air. The dull, sickening thud of bodies hitting the forest floor made Arin's stomach twist. He had known this would be a fight, but not like this. It wasn't a battlefield. It was butchery. Then came the arrows. A black storm rained from the treetops, finding gaps in armor, slicing through flesh. Boys, his friends, fell screaming, some clutching at their wounds, others never rising again. Arin's breath came fast, too fast. His knuckles turned white around his sword hilt. This isn't how it's supposed to go. Then he saw them. 6 monk-clad warriors, moving towards them with unsettling speed. Something was wrong. Their movements were too precise, too synchronized. His stomach twisted. They all had the same face. His throat closed. Edmere... Arin. Edmere's voice was steady, unshaken. Stay behind me. Arin obeyed without hesitation, stepping behind Edmere like a shadow. He hated himself for it, but his fear was stronger than his pride. The first 3 attackers struck, their blades flashing in perfect unison. Edmere met them head-on, his sword moving with brutal efficiency. A parry, a slash, 1 fell. A sidestep, a quick thrust. The second collapsed. The third barely had time to react, before Edmere's blade found her throat. Arin flinched as blood darkened the dirt. The last 3 came forward, unfazed by their fallen copies. Their movements were identical to the first. Arin's skin crawled. "What are they?" he whispered, his voice barely audible over the chaos. "Not human," Edmere muttered, raising his blade once more. The battle around them was unraveling. Half the squires were wounded, some screaming, others disturbingly silent. A dozen lay dead. Arin felt sick. This wasn't glory. This wasn't honor. The remaining 50 squires, desperate, stormed the tree line. The shadows swallowed them whole. And then they came running back. Bloodied, battered, stumbling, gasping for air. Some had lost weapons. Others cradled wounds that oozed crimson into the dirt. Arin watched as one fell to his knees, eyes wild with terror. "Something's in there," the boy gasped. It's waiting for us." A chill ran down Arin's spine. Edmere squared his shoulders, barely hesitating. He stepped forward, sword in hand, and without a word. He walked into the forest alone. Arin's breath caught. His feet wouldn't move. The darkness swallowed Edmere whole. Arin wanted to call after him, to tell him to stop. But what could he say? What would it change? His hands trembled as he took a single step forward, then another, and another. And before he could stop himself, he followed. Arin followed as quietly as he could, his breath coming in short, uneven gasps. His hands trembled around the hilt of his sword, but he gripped it tighter, as if that alone could steady him. He had no choice. He couldn't let Edmere face whatever was in there by himself. The deeper they went, the heavier the air became. The sounds of battle had faded, swallowed by the thick silence of the trees. Arin's boots barely made a sound on the mossy ground, but each step felt deafening in his ears. He felt exposed, like the very shadows were watching him. Then they found her, the Dasi. The wind howled across the snow-covered field as Edmere stood before the Dasi, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. The cold bit through Arin's cloak, but he barely felt it. His breath came heavy, his muscles tense, ready to observe the fight he knew was coming. Yet the woman before him, dressed in simple monk's robes, did not strike. She stood with an ease that came only from complete mastery of oneself. Her stance was relaxed. "I don't want to fight you," Edmere admitted, his voice low and steady. "But if you stand in my way, I'll not hesitate." The Dasi tilted her head slightly, studying him with calm, knowing eyes. "You think this is about strength?" she said softly, her voice carrying through the cold air. "About proving yourself. But tell me, Edmere of Valerie, do you know what it truly means to lead?" Edmere frowned. "I know duty," he said. "I know what it is to fight for something greater than myself." She nodded, as if considering his words. Duty is the foundation of leadership. But it is not enough. A sword alone does not make a king, and strength alone does not make a leader. If you wish to command men, to have them follow you into battle, not because they must, but because they believe in you, then you must understand something far greater than war. Edmere narrowed his eyes. "And what is that?" "Leadership," she says simply. "A man who cannot inspire will only ever rule through fear, and fear is brittle. It breaks under pressure." She gestured to the frozen landscape around them. "Look at this winter. The people do not follow a season, nor do they fear the cold into submission. But when the sun rises, they wake. When warmth returns, they gather. A leader is the sun, not the storm. He must bring warmth, not just steel." Edmere exhaled, frustration flickering across his face. "You think words and smiles win battles? I've seen good men die because they hesitated, because they thought their enemies could be reasoned with." The Dasi smiled, but there was no amusement in it. "And I have seen empires fall because their leaders thought strength was enough. Strength wins battles. Leadership wins wars." She stepped forward, not in aggression, but in purpose. "A general who cannot inspire will find himself standing alone on the battlefield. A noble who cannot command respect will watch his own men turn against him. A ruler who does not serve will not be served in return." She met his gaze, her voice steady, patient. "You seek justice, Edmere. You fight because you must. But if you wish to lead, if you wish to do more than survive, then you must learn what it means to make others believe in you." Edmere clenched his jaw, letting the words sink in. He had spent his whole life fighting, struggling to claim what had been taken from him. But what was he fighting for if no one would follow? If no one believed in him? The Dasi saw the doubt in his eyes and softened her tone. "A leader does not demand loyalty, Edmere. He earns it. Through duty, through service, through understanding." She held out a hand. "You do not need to fight me to prove yourself. But if you insist, I will teach you another lesson. With my fists." A long silence stretched between them. Then, slowly, Edmere's hand left the hilt of his sword. He exhaled, looking away for a moment, then back at her. I think I'd rather learn the first way. The Dasi smiled, and this time it was genuine. Good. Then let's begin. Arin's breath caught. She stood alone, leaning against a tree, her remaining hand methodically wrapping a bandage around the raw stump of her missing arm. Blood soaked the cloth, dark and wet, but she did not flinch. She did not groan in pain. It was unnatural. Arin had seen men scream over lesser wounds. He had seen knights crumble from a single cut. But this woman, this warrior, stood tall, as if she had simply misplaced her limb rather than lost it. Her face was calm, unreadable, but her eyes burned. Edmere didn't hesitate. He couldn't afford to. Arin watched as his fingers tightened around his sword hilt, his stance shifting ever so slightly. Prepared. Ready. The Dasi met his gaze. Then, without a word, she unsheathed her sword. The whisper of steel sent a shiver down Arin's spine. She lunged. Edmere barely caught her strike. The impact sent a shockwave through the air, rattling Arin's bones even though he stood at a distance. His breath hitched. She was fast. Faster than anything he had ever seen. Faster than any human should be. Edmere blocked another blow, but she was already moving again. Her blade slipped under his guard. Arin barely saw it before the cut was made. A clean slash across his side. Blood. Edmere barely flinched, but Arin saw the way his armor darkened. Another strike. A sharp hiss of metal against flesh. This time, across Edmere's arm. His breath was coming harder now, ragged, uneven. Arin's grip on his sword was so tight it hurt. He wanted to help. He wanted to do something. But he knew he would only be in the way. He had never felt more useless. Edmere feinted left, drawing the Dasi's attention. Then, with a sudden burst of movement, he drove his sword forward. The blade sank deep into her stomach. Arin's breath caught. She did not cry out. Her eyes widened, not in pain, but in something else. Surprise? Respect. Then, with a final burst of strength, she kicked Edmere square in the chest. The impact sent him sprawling, his sword ripping free from her flesh as he hit the ground. Arin took a step forward, his heart hammering. By the time Edmere scrambled to his feet, she was gone. The underbrush rustled. A shadow moved. A second figure followed in her wake. Arin didn't need to see her face to know. The princess. They had failed. Arin swallowed hard, his throat dry as sand. His eyes flickered to Edmere, to the blood staining his armor, to the way his shoulders rose and fell with each heavy breath. This wasn't just another test. This wasn't just another battle. They had faced a Dasi, and they weren't ready.